Greetings to everyone. This is our project Ukraine Now Vision for the Future. And this is the second time we are conducting this interview in English because today we have very special and important for me personally guest. My name is Alexander Stardutsov. Together with Victoria Kazachenko, we are serving in the National Agency for the Corruption Prevention and conducting this interview. And our project in general is about social trends and changes that are happening now in Ukraine because of this horrible and awful war. We want to realize, fix, and memorize these changes which are happening in our society and in our governments. And now we move to the second stage of our project when we want to reflect a little bit on mistakes that we make as a society, and these mistakes probably lead to this war again. And one more word about our partners. We conduct this project in the partnership with European Union Anti-Corruption Initiative and two, I think, best business schools in Ukraine, Ukrainian Catholic University Business School and Kyiv-Mohyla Business School. And now I pass floor to Victoria to introduce our guest.
Hello, everyone. Today we have a really remarkable guest, Francis Fukuyama, American political scientist and writer, director of the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy at Stanford, and the leader and supervisor of the Ukrainian Emerging Leadership Program in Stanford.
Yeah, and the National Agency on Corruption Prevention all know that Francis Fukuyama is my personal coach, teacher, sensei, and because I spent 1 year in Stanford University where Professor Fukuyama was supervising me personally. And Frank, first of all, I really happy to have you with us today, and thank you very much for being ready to participate in this interview. And now I'm trying not to miss all your public interviews on YouTube. Usually people ask you about the causes of this war, about the probability of using nuclear weapon, about your personal assessment of Vladimir Putin's mental health. And today we'll try not to ask you about these important questions, but focus more on Ukraine. Today all our interview will be devoted to Ukraine.
Very good. I'm extremely happy to talk to you again, Alexander, and have this opportunity to talk about Ukraine because it's a very important issue.
I will start with the first question about lessons of the war. As you know, the US had warned us of the risk of invasion, but anyway, such a brutal intervention was unexpected, and its consequences shocked the whole free world. And how do you think, what mistakes did Ukraine make before the start of this war, and what actions and decisions could have helped us avoid so large-scale aggression?
Well, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot that Ukraine could have done to prevent the aggression as a whole, because Putin was really not well informed about Ukraine. He obviously believed that most Ukrainians wanted to be absorbed by Russia, that they would be liberated by an invasion. And I think he believed this because he wasn't listening to real information coming from real Ukrainians. He only listened to people that were that agreed with him. It's a typical mistake for an authoritarian leader to make. And given that, there's probably no amount of prior defense buildup or warnings that Ukraine could have given. I do think that there's a fault on the part of the rest of the world, the United States and other NATO countries, that failed to respond to a whole series of aggressions that Russia undertook, not just the occupation of Crimea and Donbass in 2014, but the occupation of parts of Georgia, their intervention in Syria, in Venezuela, and many other places. I think the rest of the Western world was guilty of ignoring these early aggressions and not thinking that Russia was really serious when it got to Ukraine. That's where I think the real fault lies. But I'm not sure Ukraine itself could have done much to deter this attack.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. The next question will be regarding our official mandate of the national agency about the corruption. How do you think the war will affect the future in our corruption? Wasn't the effect of corruption overestimated by Ukrainian society? Because in Ukraine, everybody thinks that the whole government is totally corrupt. What do you think will happen with corruption after we hope our victory in this war?
Well, I think that if Ukraine emerges victorious, we can discuss this further, but I believe it will, then that presents a tremendous opportunity to reform Ukrainian institutions from top to bottom. Sasha, as you know, there's this theory by Charles Tilly, this sociologist, that said that war makes the state and the state makes war, that historically it's been military conflict that has driven the modernization of states, because if you have a highly corrupt state where officers are stealing from their men, material is being siphoned off, you're going to lose the next war. And that actually appears to be exactly what's been going on the Russian side, that, we're getting all these reports of Russian soldiers not being paid, not being fed, because their officers are stealing. But on the other hand, the war has created tremendous incentives for national unity. In fact, it's been a big inspiration, I think, to the rest of the world to watch the way that Ukrainians have come together to defend their own sovereignty and their own freedom. And I think it's created this recognition on the part of many Ukrainians that, if they steal from the state, they're going to not survive. They and their families won't survive the war. So it creates very, very strong incentives to do the right thing. And hopefully, that experience, that common experience, will both strengthen Ukrainian national identity and will also change the nature of Ukrainian institutions once the war is over.
One clarification, Frank. In addition to corruption, what other post-Soviet, post-colonial disease could be eliminated after the war?
Well, I think that there are a lot of cultural practices that were left over from Soviet times. For example, in most post-communist countries, the level of trust between ordinary citizens is very low. The Soviet state encouraged this. They didn't want people to cooperate with each other spontaneously. They wanted everything to go through the party. That was the only organizing principle. So, private associations, civil society, labor unions, all of these things really were created by the state, but they didn't really have a reality independently of the party state. I think that it's something that I've noticed in the Ukrainians we've dealt with, that there's still a little bit of this legacy of this, difficulty in cooperating horizontally. But I think the war is likely to change that, because we've seen lots of examples of, Ukrainian. I mean, you see this in the military, where there's now a very decentralized command structure. You don't have to wait for the general at the top to give an order in order to take the initiative and do something. The lower level officers are given the authority to do that, or even ordinary soldiers can make decisions on their own. And hopefully this will have a cultural effect throughout Ukrainian society, where there will be a strong, growing level of trust among Ukrainians because of this common experience. I think this is really what you call nation building, this idea that there's a national unity and a kind of national purpose that everybody is pursuing. And I think that may be one of the consequences of the war also.
Cool, thank you. And how do you think, what does this war really mean for Ukraine for Russia and the whole free world, and what we are fighting for, and how Ukraine as a sovereign nation should act and build relations with Russia after the victory?
Well, this has now been said by many people, but I think it bears repeating that this war was really not just about Ukraine. It was really about the entire democratic order that had been built after 1989 or 1991, when the former Soviet Union fell apart. That led to a massive expansion in the number of democratic countries. So all of the countries that had been former members of the Warsaw Pact were now free to determine their own futures. And many of the Union republics of the former Soviet Union became independent nations, beginning with Ukraine. In fact, it was really Ukraine that guaranteed this process going forward when Ukraine voted for its own independence in 1991. And that's really, I think, what Putin doesn't like. It's not a military threat from an expanded NATO. It's the fact that all these countries didn't want to be subjects of Russia, that they wanted to be independent, sovereign countries that could make their own decisions. And I think he wants to reverse that. And in fact, it's not just in the former Soviet territories or in Eastern Europe, it's really everywhere. He wants dictatorship to be the dominant principle, tied to Russia in a network of mutual support. And so that's why he sent forces to Venezuela, to Nicaragua, to Syria, to a whole bunch of countries that really historically were not, related to any serious Russian interest, but he believes that he has an ideological interest now in supporting anyone that is anti-Western and authoritarian. And so that's why I think it matters a great deal for the entire world and not just for Ukraine and the immediate neighborhood of Russia.
Frank, what are your current feelings about how this war can be ended? How long will it last? When it can be ended? With which consequences? How Ukraine can look like after our victory?
Well, the one thing I don't believe is what's become a kind of conventional wisdom in many circles in the West, which is that the war is stalemated, that neither side can make any gains, and that it's going to be a long war, just like the war in the Donbass after 2014. This is, I think, a very dangerous view, because it then means that if people want peace, if they want to reopen, the economies of the region, that there has to be a peace negotiation based on the current disposition of forces. And I think that would be very disastrous, because it means that Russia would be left in control of much of the Donbass and then much of the south of Ukraine. And it would be rewarding them for this aggression. But it also wouldn't solve the underlying causes of the war, because Russia isn't going to be satisfied holding on to just that part of Ukraine. The moment they rearm and feel stronger, they're going to resume the war. So at best, it would buy a temporary truce. So I think that really the most important objective, which I think is completely achievable, is actually to liberate the south of Ukraine. Right now, there's obviously been a big focus on Kherson and, the oblasts that border on the Black Sea. For economic purposes, that's very important to return those areas to Ukrainian control, because you have to be able to export. Fortunately, because of this deal brokered by Turkey and the United Nations, there's now exports going out of Odessa. But, frankly, all of those Black Sea ports are really critical to Ukraine's economic future. And I think, therefore, the liberation of those southern oblasts is really the critical issue right now. And I believe that that's something that's achievable. I think, indeed, I think it's achievable by the end of this year. I don't think we're going to have to wait, 2, 3, 4 years for this to happen. And in fact, if it doesn't happen fairly soon, then you get into this, I think, unfortunate situation where a lot of outside countries begin pressuring Ukraine to make concessions. I think that the only time you can have a serious negotiation with Russia is after they have suffered a military defeat and they feel like their position is collapsing. And at that point, you might have a serious negotiation about the future of, the relations between these two. But, not until that happens.
There is no secret. Ukraine largely depends on international support, both economic and military. And how do we save this support of the free world, and including the United States? And what should we do about this from our side? And what should our international partners maybe improve on their part?
Well, I think that given our assumptions before the war began, it's actually been quite remarkable the level of support that Ukraine has gotten up to this point. You wouldn't have expected Germany. I mean, I know that the Germans have been very slow and reluctant, but, it still constitutes a big change in their foreign policy to support Ukraine with weapons. It could be faster. I think that the United States could have delivered the HIMARS systems more rapidly. They could deliver more of them. There's other systems that, would be very useful to Ukraine right now. And I hope that, the delivery of those weapons will be accelerated. That's the major issue right now. But a lot of it really does depend on the appearance of momentum in the war, because as I said, the most damaging thing is the belief that we're in a long war. Over the summer, The Economist had a cover that about Ukraine and Russia, with the title "A Long War." And if people believe that this is going to be a long war that will go on for years, that's not a good situation, because, as I said, that's what encourages all of the outside powers to begin pressuring, Ukraine to start making concessions. And so I think, honestly, what you need is some forward momentum. I mean, if Kherson could be liberated in the coming months, that would be a very powerful demonstration of the fact that Ukraine still has a lot of military options. And I believe, something like that is in the, it's within the power of Ukraine to bring that about. And that, in turn, will unlock further weapons and further support.
Actually, in July, Ukraine present in Lugano our recovery plan. Maybe you see that. And what do you think actually about our recovery plans? And what should be Ukraine's recovery principles? And also, what can we draw any conclusions from the past reconstructions, from Marshall Plan, etc.?
Well, I think that Ukraine's requirements for recovery will be enormous, and all of the friends of Ukraine on the outside are going to have to step up to do this once there is an end to the war. I think the primary responsibility will fall on the Europeans, and I think that they're probably going to be willing to do a lot in this regard. But the nature of the recovery, I think, we need to pay attention to the political side of the recovery and not just the economic recovery. The economic recovery presents opportunities because Ukraine was very dependent on old 20th century heavy industry, steel production and coal and fertilizer and all of these big industries that were predominantly in the eastern part of Ukraine. I think that, Ukraine needed to make a transition anyhow into more of a knowledge economy based on technology and so forth. And so there's an economic opportunity to make investments, not to recover this old heavy industry, but to really modernize the Ukrainian economy as a whole, using the brain power of younger Ukrainians that is really pretty substantial. The other thing that I think is important is to change the nature of Ukrainian politics. I know that there is now this anti-oligarch law, that requires people that are classified as oligarchs to put themselves in a special category that allows the state to put limits on them. I think that there's another thing that's quite crucial, which is reform of the media sector, because one of the big problems previously, before the war, was the fact that all of the big media channels were controlled by a different oligarch, and they were used to protect that oligarch's interest. And I think that as we get to the end of the war, that's a system that needs to be changed. I mean, there's no reason why, the owner of a big industrial conglomerate should also own a TV station and a newspaper and, media properties like that. And in fact, because it's very hard to make money running a TV media outlet, the only people that were willing to do this were rich oligarchs that were making money elsewhere and could put this money into the media channel. But then they were doing that not because it was a profit-making business. They did this because that was a way to protect their political and economic interests. And that system needs to be broken, maybe through much improved public broadcasting, through some way of making media independent of these wealthy people. And I think that that would free the space for a more genuine kind of democracy, in a future Ukraine. So there are many, many things that could be done, for recovery, to modernize Ukraine as a whole. And I think, this is an opportunity that really needs to be seized once the war begins to wind down.
Frank, let's move to another very important for us topic, sanctions. You know that from the very beginning of the war, the National Agency on Corruption Prevention is very active in personal sanctions. We're truly grateful to Mike McFaul, who is leading this working group for sanctions, and probably the whole Stanford University for supporting us with that. From your point of view, how effective are personal and sectoral sanctions? How can we press this Russian autocratic society, and what can we do more with that?
Well, I think that sanctions are actually going to be more effective than people realize, primarily in terms of technology, because a lot of Russian industry, including a lot of their military industries, depends actually on Western technology. And, you're already seeing this big problem that Russia has. They can't service their Airbus and Boeing airliners because, the sanctions has cut off the supply of spare parts. And so they have to cannibalize existing airplanes to get spare parts. And gradually, that whole sector is going to shut down. Their automotive industry is basically shut down because they can't get Western parts. And a lot of their military production over the next few months is gradually going to, suffer a lot because of this. Oil and gas is a different issue. I think there it's a question of who gets through the winter politically. I think that, Europe is eventually going to wean itself off of Russian energy, but that's obviously something that's politically difficult, and it's going to take time. I think that there are a lot of individual oligarchs that still have not been sanctioned and that could be, and they're getting away with a lot. They're able to enjoy life in the West, or their families can, and they continue to support Putin. It's interesting, Navalny yesterday or the day before did this long series of tweets about all of the oligarchs that are still running around, without being sanctioned, that really should be on the sanctions list. And so I think it's important to do that. We just actually had a meeting of our Draper Hill Summer Fellows, and the Georgian fellows pointed out that Bidzina Ivanishvili, who's the big oligarch in Georgia, pro-Russian, still has a lot of assets in Russia, and he has not been put on a sanctions list. He is really had a very bad influence in Georgia. He doesn't have an official position. He operates behind the scenes, but he has been pushing Georgia in a pro-Russian direction, not to join, broader Western sanctions and, kind of undermining Georgian democracy. And so there are oligarchs outside of Russia that are pro-Russian, that also could be targeted by Western sanctions. And so I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to go after these individuals and to broaden that list. Right now, there's this argument about whether Europe should start suspending ordinary tourist visas for Russian citizens. That's a kind of complicated issue because there's a lot of anti-Putin Russians that also, need protection and shelter. But I do think that there's probably a way of, discriminating between those that are political supporters of Putin and those that are not. Given how much the Russians are complaining about this, I probably think that this is a pretty effective way of pressuring them and showing that they can't continue with life as normal, if they continue this war.
We'll pass this information about Ivanishvili to our colleagues who are in charge of sanctions. Using this possibility, I want to promote our portal, web portal, sanctions.nazk.gov.ua, where we have all the lists of the people that we already sanctioned. And there are a lot of information there. There is open API, so you can download it in any format. So we provide a big data set about these sanctioned personalities. One clarification from my side. I just wonder, from your point of view, what is more effective, personal sanctions or sectoral sanctions?
I don't have a strong opinion about this. I think they're both important. I think, like I said, the sectoral sanctions are really getting at the industrial base of Russia and are weakening it over time. It's a slow impact, but it is going to have a big impact. But I do think that the personal sanctions also, will have a long-term political impact because it's going to get at that elite that, has been supporting Putin and whom Putin has been supporting all of these years, and showing them that, there's really a cost to continuing to do that. Plus which, it just seems to me morally unacceptable that these people can support the Russian war effort and then go to their vacation houses in France or Switzerland or London and live with impunity.
I think about our victory because all Ukrainians, believe that we'll have our victory. And the question is how we can speed it up, and also what should we do to not miss our historic chance?
Well, I really think that so much of that depends on the outcome of the military conflict. Normally I would say that military force can't solve a lot of political problems, and I think that's a general truism that applies in many situations. But when you're fighting a war, that's not the case. When you're fighting a war, the actual outcome of the military engagement will determine the politics for years to come. And therefore, a lot is riding on the Ukrainian general staff, on their strategy for fighting Russia. I think that up till now, it's been an extremely intelligent one that has recognized, the weaknesses both of Russia but also Ukraine's weaknesses and has adapted to that quite well. And it's really a matter of keeping up a flow of armaments and the right kinds of armaments. For example, what's just happened in the past week is this demonstration that Crimea is not a safe area for Russia. The Russians have regarded this as a secure logistics base by which they can operate in other parts of southern Ukraine with impunity. And I think, Ukraine has demonstrated that that's not the case. And so there's a lot of things that could happen. They could take out that bridge over the Kerch Straits, or they could hit, more Russian bases in Crimea and make it clear to Russia that even that is not a secure area that they can count on holding. And, that would be something that would actually be the basis for a more serious kind of negotiation down the road. So I really do think that, everything really now depends on the success of the military operations, the flow of outside support, and there are many other forms of support. I think that the Ukrainian economy has suffered, really unbelievably over the course of the war. And it's not going to continue without help from the outside in terms of debt forgiveness, support for balance of payments, all of these sorts of things. And I think that needs to continue, as well.
Frank, our project is right now at this stage about the mistakes that we made and what lessons can be learned from that, from your point of view. For the last 30 plus years, what mistakes did we make as a society, as a government, and what should we start correcting already?
I think I've said this to you in the past. I don't think that it's really the role of outsiders to do a catalog of mistakes, because someone like me doesn't have the knowledge, the deep knowledge of what's been happening in Ukraine over the past years. I know something of that story, but the real analysis needs to be done by Ukrainians. And so I'm not going to sit here and tell you, oh yeah, you did this and that wrong, and you should correct this and that. That kind of help, I think, is probably not that useful. I think that you have to do your own analysis. Obviously, Ukraine had weak institutions in many ways. It had deficiencies in human resources. It had corruption. It had different sorts of things. But I think that, the priorities in terms of fixing those are really ones that you're going to have to figure out yourself with help from the outside. Outsiders will have a lot of leverage because Ukraine, if you're going to rebuild your economy, you're going to require a lot of outside assistance, a lot of resources coming from the outside. And so the outsiders will impose conditions and will have lots of advice and so forth. But it's fundamentally going to be up to Ukrainians to figure out what the priorities are. For example, just taking your issue of corruption, I think that probably the Ukrainian view of the importance of corruption and the centrality of it has changed as a result of the war. Most Ukrainians I've spoken to actually don't think that that's going to be the central problem going forward, and there are other structural issues that, may be more urgent to address, although obviously corruption is something that everybody's going to worry about. And so, like I said, this is really, I think, the priority of these different issues is really something that only Ukrainians are going to be able to really, decide upon.
We definitely understand that this is our responsibility to fix all these problems and push our country forward. But anyway, the independent view is really helpful. For the end of our interview, we ask all the people that we have interviewed with, which book would you recommend to read for Ukrainians to understand what's going on, and what lessons should we learn from all of that?
That's that's a really hard question to answer, because there isn't a single book, I would say, that provides the the right advice and structure for how to recover from the kind of war that you fought. I do think that you want to pay attention to the experience actually of Japan and Germany after 1945, because you had a similar devastation of the economy and then a rebuilding of democratic institutions in both of those countries, both of which were incredibly successful. The institutions were fixed. They had new constitutions, new political orders that made them, I think, deeply democratic in the years after. And there's actually a lot of lessons about, how do you deal with the old bureaucracy? You inherit an old corrupt bureaucracy from the previous regime. You want to fix it, but you also need the expertise and manpower to actually move ahead. And that's a very difficult, problem to solve. So I would think that, maybe paying attention to those issues. Again, just another analogy, both Japan and Germany had the equivalent of oligarchs before the war. Both of them had industrial sectors that were organized into these big cartels, where you had a lot of companies that, like IG Farben in Germany or Mitsubishi in Japan, that were heavily involved in corruption and dominated the economies. And there's an effort to dismantle them after the war ended. It was more successful in Germany than it was in Japan. But again, that's a kind of similar problem to Ukraine, where you've got these oligarchic conglomerates that dominated the economy, and you want to have a more competitive one. What are some of the lessons you might be able to draw from those earlier experiences? So rather than a single book, I would say that there are some historical precedents for what you're going to face that might be very helpful to look at.
I traditionally would hardly recommend to read Francis Fukuyama's book, Political Order, Political Decay, where all these cases about post-war Japan, post-war Germany are brilliantly described. And this book is translated to Ukrainian already by the publishing house Nash Format. So you can read it in English, you can read it in Ukrainian. I would recommend to read another Frank's book, Identity. I know that one more book was released recently about the liberalism, but it's not translated to Ukrainian yet, and I didn't order it from Amazon, unfortunately. Yeah, so Frank, maybe there are some other questions, issues that you want to comment that we didn't ask you before during this interview?
No, I think that we've covered, a lot of the important ones. So all I can say is that I'm in awe of what Ukraine has accomplished this year in terms of stomping Russia and mounting this very inspiring defense. I think that your country is an inspiration to the entire free world. I wish that we had the kind of patriotism and commitment, in other places that you have demonstrated in Ukraine. And so I would just say congratulations on that. Keep it up. I do think that you are going to be victorious in the end. And, then we can talk about rebuilding the country in a in a better way.
Thank you for these kind words. We're truly grateful for all the support that you provide to Ukrainians with all these educational programs, Leadership Academy for Development, Ukrainian Emerging Leaders Program, that Stanford University provides to Ukraine, personally Mike McFaul provides to Ukraine. We really appreciate all this support, and it's very important for us to understand that the whole world supports us now with this really horrific war. Just as an end, I want to remind that was our project of the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, Ukraine Now, Vision for the Future. And during this project, we are trying to understand the mistakes, the lessons learned, and the general principles how Ukraine should be recovered. Thank you once again. That was a cool interview, and we're happy that you joined us today.
Thank you very much for having me, and good luck to all of you.
Thank you so much, friend.